Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? We're talking about censorship, one of the biggest drivers of mistrust of public health today. During the pandemic, was it okay for the government to try to get social media companies to take down posts and videos about the virus and vaccines they deemed wrong and dangerous? Some say stifling free speech. Today, with the Trump administration now in charge of public health, is it okay for them to scrub speech about diversity and gender that they deem destructive, some saying threatening to scuttle research? In America today, we find ourselves caught in a battle between science and free speech, two sides that historically weren't always at each other's throats. So how do we get here? Who gets to decide if speech is harmful to your health? Where exactly is the line between content moderation and censorship? A lot to get to, so let's get started. Welcome back. I'm Bhattacharya.
I'm Tom Johnson.
Hey, Bartlett.
I'm Dr. Mark.
So she meant to say Maggie Bartlett.
What did I say?
Well, I think the audio dropped out.
We sort of just got Bartlett.
We just got Bartlett.
Okay, got it. Well, I'm Maggie Bartlett.
Yes, you are. Tom, who are we?
All right. Brenda and I are journalists. Maggie's a virologist. Mark is a doctor.
Yes, he is. Guys, do you know what today is?
No.
Today we are recording our 10th episode.
What?
Happy anniversary.
Wow.
I'm just, look, 10th anniversary. I mean, not, it's not our 10th anniversary. It's our 10th episode anniversary. I feel like 10 is a big number. When my kid turned 10, we were like, oh my God, double digits. 10.
Mark kept saying we're never going to get to 10.
Yeah. Always a skeptic. Always a skeptic.
That's right. Mark's the real skeptic. But look, we just want to thank our listeners. We're a team that works really hard. We love what we do. And so thank you guys so much. Okay, so today, this is one of those topics, guys, that comes up again and again within the communities that we're actively speaking with, and that is censorship. You know, folks who were mistrustful of public health during the pandemic feel that throughout that time, when they or their trusted sources for information raised objections or went against the grain of mainstream public health, they were silenced. They saw videos being taken offline. They saw accounts being suspended. They read posts about professors at top universities being muzzled. And I'll tell you, just from one person I heard from who texted me, told me that something she posted on Facebook about how ivermectin was being used in India during COVID was flagged as being inappropriate, and it was taken down. And then you flash forward to today, you've got a new administration in charge with many of the leaders of the mistrustful communities who once cried foul on censorship during the pandemic. Well, now they're in charge of public health. And to many scientists we've heard from, it appears the tables have now turned and the censorship, they say, has flipped. And like I said, you know, it's our 10th episode, so we thought we'd have a little party. We're joined today not by one, but by two guests.
Yes.
It is a party.
Party line.
We met Wilk Wilkinson through Braver Angels, the organization you've heard us raving about, whose mission is to convene civil dialogue between the different sides on some of our most intractable issues today. And Wilk is a Braver Angels leader, aiming to bring clarity and empathy to difficult conversations. Wilk calls himself a, quote, blue-collar sage, a steadfast Christian conservative who was a former truck driver who worked his way up and now manages operations at a trucking company, something he did during the pandemic in central Minnesota. Wilk says he saw firsthand the devastating impact of the lockdowns and the mandates on business and on his neighbors' livelihoods. These days, Wilk has his own podcast called Derate The Hate. Check it out. A couple of us have gotten to know Wilk over the past year, and we're really happy to welcome to our show. Hi, Wilk.
Hello.
Welcome,
Good to have
Wilk.
me. Thank you.
Welcome.
And we're also joined today by Dr. Maciej Boni, a professor of biology at Temple University. He's an infectious disease epidemiologist who worked on the front lines of the swine flu pandemic in 2009 and different bird flu outbreaks in Southeast Asia. He studies, among other things, how deadly viruses spread and develop resistance to treatments. He's also, full disclosure, in the interest of transparency, a dear friend of my family's. I've known Maciej for years, and I gotta say, we called him a bunch during the pandemic. He was like our lifeline. And he was in the trenches, you know, working with state public health departments round the clock to stop the spread of COVID. Hi, Maciej.
Maciej.
Hi, everyone. Really good to be here.
Philadelphia representing strong.
Brenda, did you call him during swine flu?
You know, that was 2009. I felt
so much.
differently maybe then. I don't know. I don't think so. I think you were on your own for that, Maciej. I think you were alone.
Nobody called this during swine flu.
Well, listen, we invited both Wilk and Maciej onto our show because they both happen to care deeply about rebuilding trust in our society and both have smart insights based on their experiences. And we asked them to think about this topic we're taking on today, about this deeply fraught moment we're in as far as censorship and government and science. And we'll hear from them in a minute. But look, Tom, if there's one thing we can all agree on as Americans, it's that basically everyone thinks that there's some type of censorship going on, whether it's in the last few weeks or it was during the COVID years. So kick it off for us. How did we get to this moment?
Yeah, I think a place to start, and it's such a huge topic, you can kind of pick your own place, but I think a place to start would be the end of August of last year. I think it was August 26th. It was 2 months before the election. And Mark Zuckerberg, of course, of Meta, Facebook, like he pulls the pin on a hand grenade and just rolls it out into the country. And by that, I mean, he sends Jim Jordan, the House Republican member, a letter. And in it, he says that Meta, which, you know, in addition to Facebook, owns WhatsApp and Instagram, he basically says that he wishes he could have a do-over. And in that, I mean, he says that they were pressured by the Biden administration to squelch disfavored speech during the pandemic. And that if he's taken, you know, something from this process of going through the pandemic, he really wishes that they had pushed back more on the Biden administration. He basically says that in 2021, so again, remember, 2020 pandemic hits. By 2021, we've got a vaccine, but we are still in sort of the peak of the pandemic. He says that the White House repeatedly pressured his teams for months to curtail content that the Biden administration thought was misinformation. And that also included even things like humor and satire. He says, in the end of the day, Meta made its own calls on what to remove, but he regrets that he didn't push back harder. He says in the letter, quote, "I feel strongly we should not compromise our content standards due to pressure from any administration in either direction. And we're ready to push back if something like this happens again." So the right pounces and they say, this is proof. There was this big pressure campaign on the part of the Biden administration on Facebook to censor what users were saying, what they were sharing about COVID. The Biden administration quickly puts out a statement saying, "Our position's been clear and consistent. We believe tech companies and other private actors should take into account the effects of their actions and the effect that those actions have on the American people while making independent choices about the information they present."
Yeah, I mean, Tom, that
Yeah.
letter from Mark to Congress, I mean, it comes on the heels of, you know, this big investigation that had already happened. And, you know, in it is the so-called Facebook files, where you kind of get this behind the scenes, behind the curtain glimpse as to what was going on. I mean, all these communications between Facebook and the White House are made public. And I wonder if Mark's letter is in a way of his final take on all of that. But, you know, you chose August of last year to start this timeline. You know, I'm going to throw out there, go back further in time.
Mhm.
And really, it's, you know, the pandemic tested us like nothing ever. At the peak, thousands of people were dying a day, and everybody wants information. And at that time, the White House was a place that you turned to information. I mean, if you remember, every day there was a briefing, you know, public health experts. It was almost every day. And, you know, people wanted to know what was happening and what they needed to do to stay safe. And everybody was essentially all ears. You know, all these messages get put out, and it doesn't take very long, as in almost any story, for a counter story to start brewing. And then that story starts spreading and sets in. And, you know, the first kind of big episode of that is May of 2020, just a few months after the pandemic. And you had this release of a pretty thrilling 26-minute film titled Plandemic. Right now we're starting to play on words. It was released on YouTube and spread via Facebook. And it basically said COVID-19 was being exaggerated and manipulated by government officials and scientists, and they wanted to suppress natural treatments and set the stage so that big profits could be made by big pharma. And, you know, one of the shocking claims in it was that masks can actually activate the virus. Now, remember, at the time, and at this point, Trump is president. So we're still away from like a lot of the pressuring that Zuckerberg is talking about. It 6 months away from Biden even being elected president at this point. But The social media companies, I mean, this is not their first rodeo. They know that they have a problem here and they pounce. So within days of that video being put out, they stop it on their own. It was already widely viewed. I mean, it was viewed 8 million times on YouTube,
Wow.
tens of millions more on Facebook and Twitter. And then even when it's stopped, I mean, there are other websites like almost underground, Telegram, Rumble, all these other websites where you can get clips of it. I mean, it's viral and it's global. But that one was taken down within a few days, which is pretty fast, actually. Then, just like in Hollywood, there's a sequel released in August of 2020. And now it's called Plandemic Indoctrination. And I think the makers, hard to really say why they released it, but the claims were sticking in some places, in some communities. But this time, the claims in the sequel were even bigger. It was like a global conspiracy. It was being planned by elites. But this time, it's moderated and taken down within hours. So the social media companies pounce even faster. So
pretty soon after that, Maggie, like the vaccine comes out and that changes the game.
Yeah, that's really when things start to take off, is the government announces we have a COVID vaccine. In science, we were anxiously hoping for something like this so that we could stem the tide of this growing pandemic. And the big hurdle now was going to be to get that vaccine out to the public, which was clamoring to get it.
And Facebook is prepared. I mean, they know that they have a responsibility. They say they're going to remove posts that are spreading information about the vaccines that contradict what the government health agencies are saying. They spell it out in a blog post and they say, quote, this is another way that we are applying our policy to remove misinformation about the vaccine that could lead to imminent physical harm. This could include false claims about the safety, efficacy, ingredients, or side effects of the vaccine. And then they go on, false claims that COVID-19 vaccines contain microchips or anything else that isn't on the official vaccine ingredient list. But for all the talk that government, particularly the Democrats, were pressuring social media companies to take down information. This is December 2020. Trump is finishing up his first term and Biden doesn't come in for another month. So this is all still pre the Biden administration.
Right. So basically they're saying we're on board with the COVID vaccine. And when we see information spreading on our site that contradicts, say, the CDC, we're going to take it down. This is just too deadly a moment to tolerate that. And then just in January of this year, so, not that long ago, the same week that Meta ended its DEI programs and disbanded its fact-checking operation, Mark Zuckerberg sits down for a 3-hour conversation with Joe Rogan, and he explains that Facebook's approach back in 2021, he once explained that approach and how they now see things differently. So let's take a listen.
It was during the Biden administration when they were trying to roll out the vaccine program. And I'm generally pretty pro rolling out vaccines. I think on balance, the vaccines are more positive than negative. But I think that while they're trying to push that program, they also tried to censor anyone who is basically arguing against it. And they pushed us super hard to take down things that were true, right? I mean, they basically pushed us and said, anything that says that vaccines might have side effects, you basically need to take down. And I was just like, well, we're not going to do that. We're clearly not going to do that. I mean, that is kind of inarguably true.
Who is they? Who's telling you to take down things that
it was
that talk about vaccine side effects?
It was people in the Biden administration.
Okay, so that was Mark Zuckerberg on Rogan a couple of months ago.
Yeah, and you can hear him right there. He's saying, Facebook, we already have a policy. We fact check. He'd given a speech at Georgetown in October, just a few months before the pandemic hits. And he talks about the company's responsibilities to remove content when it can cause real danger. And they're going to do that as effectively as they can. But at the same time, they want to fight to uphold a wide definition of freedom of expression, like the widest definition as possible, and not allow the definition of what is considered dangerous to expand beyond what's absolutely necessary. So he's trying to navigate that even before the pandemic hits. Obviously, a lot of that comes off of the 2016 election. That's a different podcast, a whole different conversation. But here we are, we're, as Mark said, we've got hundreds, of Americans dying each day, into the thousands. It's a crazy, crazy moment. January 2021, the Biden administration, as we just said, takes over. And pretty soon they're meeting with Facebook about misinformation, and things are getting more and more strained. The New York Times went back and talked to a lot of the people in those meetings, back in 21, and they described it as saying, quote, "The White House and other federal agencies have pressed the company to hand over data about how anti-vaccine narratives spread online, and they've accused Facebook of withholding key information." So tempers are starting to flare, and I think some of that is because we're now seeing the deadly Delta virus strain march across the country. And as that is kind of marching across the country, we've got the Biden administration sets a goal. They want by July 4th, 70% of Americans to get at least the first vaccine shot. And as we roll into July of 2021, that holiday comes and goes, and they just miss that goal. They miss it by, a couple million people. And again, the New York Times reporting on this paints the picture. The Biden team feels, quote, "The site is not doing enough and they are angry. Facebook is pushing back, saying it's removed 18 million pieces of misinformation since the start of the pandemic." But, this is getting more and more tense. And Maciej, I think it'd be interesting just if we could just grab you and say, go back in time, if you can, back to 2021. We've got this vaccine. It's being raced out. We're missing goals as a country to get people vaccinated. There's misinformation flying on social media. What was it like for you to see that vaccine hesitancy while at the same time seeing misinformation about the vaccines moving through social media?
Yeah, so January to July was that key period when we wanted to get vaccine coverage up into the 70% range. And then, as everyone knows, trust just wasn't high enough in public health at that point to get people on the same page that the vaccine is probably the best way to get us to a high level of immunity, the best way to get us to a place where there won't be any more large epidemics or outbreaks. But I think the trust was broken before that. I don't think it was that 6-month period that was the failure. I think in early 2020, mid to late 2020, there were already 1 or 2 or 3 information battles that started to be fought and, essentially were lost by public health because we didn't have the right training to sort of combat this live while it was happening. And so by the time we got to that winter wave, so December 2020, January 2021, I think at that point, there were already enough Americans who didn't trust the approach that when we started rolling out the vaccine, we just didn't have as much trust as we needed.
Yeah.
Maciej, was it
sorry.
The testing? Like what do you mean? Like what went wrong early on that made these big fractures in trust?
I mean, I'll go through the first 2 or 3 sort of major surprises that we faced. I mean, the very first one in March 2020 was a wave of misinformation that came in that said the coronavirus is not dangerous, that the death rate is much lower than what's being reported in the news. So that was March 2020. October 2020, there was a new platform of let's let everybody get infected with the coronavirus. That's the best way to sort of get ourselves through this pandemic. So we weren't really prepared. We didn't have in our public health outline that someone was going to suggest that we just relax and have most people get infected with the virus. And then with those 2 things in the background, and then this 2.5-month period between the election and Biden being inaugurated, the vaccine results came out, vaccine communications started coming out into the foreground as the next thing that would be done. And we saw that mistrust pop up right away. I think we knew in January 21 that we wouldn't get to 70 or 80% vaccine coverage easily.
Yeah. Wilk, as we pause in this history lesson here, we're using the term misinformation a lot. There's just such a spectrum of information that's flowing through social media every second of every day. When you hear us say, the Biden administration's upset about misinformation and this idea that perhaps that is contributing to people not getting the vaccine, how do you react? Is that the right term? Is that the term you would use? Or would you say these guys have it wrong? Misinformation to them is critical life-saving information to the rest of us.
I think it's hugely important to remember that misinformation was not exclusive to one side or the other. And that's where a lot of this gets lost in translation because, you had people like, name any one of several liberal talk show hosts, may it be Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon or Anderson Cooper or things like that, who are getting up there in a very condescending, very maniacal way, it seemed, to say, if you don't get this vaccine, you are killing your grandmother, you are killing your neighbor, you are doing this. But if you do get the vaccine, the virus stops with you, which we know is not true, right? So I just want to, I only say that to say this. Many of the things that I heard then, I continue to hear now. I have had the opportunity to build great relationships with many of the people that have actually been suppressed by social media platforms. I also want to, just to be fair, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the social media suppression did start under the first Trump administration. I mean, when you go back and look at the Twitter files that were done through the Free Press and Barry Weiss and Matt Taibbi and my friend David Zweig and things like that. I mean, they acknowledge that some of that suppression of speech started during the Trump administration and then carried on much more prevalently during the Biden administration. The term misinformation, I don't think is a bad term because there is certainly plenty of it out there. I mean, you have a lot of people out there that, were, outrage entrepreneurs and grievance grifters all over the place trying to capitalize on people's fears and people's grievances. And in doing so, we're promoting things. You talked about the movie Plandemic, but I've heard others, people in continuing to serve in our government today, I've heard them call it a plandemic or a scamdemic. I don't think that was the most mainstream approach, but we cannot discount all of the mistrust that was built for our public institutions because of the way this was handled by those who were supposed to be representing us. So whether they be those in the media or whether they be those in our government or what have you, the messaging was frankly, it was terrible. You had people even like Anthony Fauci going to a baseball game after telling everybody that he had to wear a mask, but he's got his mask around his chin, right? Or you've got messages coming out of, don't buy the mask because we don't need a mask, but then a week later we do have a mask, but it was never explained well as to why we said what we said when we said it. And now we're experiencing something different, or we have new information. So to try and say that misinformation is exclusive to one side or the other, or to try and say that the suppression of free speech is exclusive to one side or the other, is not accurate.
Yeah, Tom.
Yeah. So anyway, Facebook in a blog post says, hey, to the administration, to the Biden administration, hey, quit the finger pointing. As of this July 4th vaccination goal, like, Facebook is not the reason this goal was missed. But the tension is rising. Biden heads off to Camp David on this Friday afternoon in August. And as he's boarding Marine One, he turns to the press and he says of social media companies, they're killing people. So that comment reverberates around. You can see just at this point, the Biden administration saying, we are not hitting these goals. If we don't get people vaccinated, they die. And social media is just not doing enough to police the sites and get the misinformation about the vaccines off the sites.
We're at that point, we're in that mad rush to get people vaccinated. And so I think to understand a problem, you have to know what the problem is and then try to put forth a solution. So it turns into, like, how big is this disinformation or misinformation problem? And then we hear this phrase, disinformation doesn't. And it comes out that people believe that there are about 12 people who are responsible for 65% of the misinformation out there. And the leader of that pack is labeled none other than Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the current HHS secretary. And Facebook is feeling the heat because they know that this is out there, and they know they have a sense of how many people are posting and what they're posting, but they want to know, like, is the different disinformation dozen lurking on the platform in other areas? I mean, they do all this analysis. I mean, the Facebook files are, rich with numbers. And at some point, Facebook takes the position like, look, I think the White House thinks that if we just take away these 12 accounts, this is going to cause 65% of the anti-vax misinformation just to go away. And nothing has been that simple. And it's just not that simple.
There's been a lot of science on how quickly disinformation spreads versus, facts on social media platforms. And that's a big difference there that adds to the fuel of these different campaigns that we've seen online.
Yeah.
Another thing.
Yeah, go ahead. Is that Wilk?
Yeah. Another thing that I want to make sure that people understand about it is the martyr effect too. Mark, you talk about if we just, the idea of just if we just cancel these 12 people, all of this misinformation goes away. Well, it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away completely by any means, but it actually makes those that were spreading it probably more powerful than they were in the beginning. And it makes their message that much more powerful, because now that those that actually buy into many of these conspiracy theories and things like that, see, there it is. They took them down, and they did it for this reason. It makes them more powerful, and it actually has the opposite of the intended effect.
Yeah.
Kind of lit the flame, really.
So look, when it comes to the administration pushing these social media companies to police content, regardless of if they say it's misinformation or not, it's hard to overstate just how angry and suspicious this makes a wide swath of Americans. Back in June of 2020, Pew conducts a poll and finds that roughly 3/4 of adults in this country say that it's very or somewhat likely that social media sites intentionally censored viewpoints that they found objectionable. So again, a huge portion of this country thinks big government and big tech are colluding to squash the First Amendment. One example that's, yeah.
I mean, I do think going back to June 2020 and spring 2020 is the right place for this conversation, because by the time we get to 21, the mistrust is already there. Wilk went through pointing out what happened on the other side. So you had Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper, putting out messaging that they're not scientists, they're not epidemiologists, but they're putting out messaging that comes across as condescending, and it doesn't really help anybody. And then you have to ask yourself this question. So it's an information management question before we even get to misinformation. You have to ask this question, well, how do you manage information in an emergency? So who's in charge? So there's a hurricane and someone's announcing that there's an evacuation route. Someone does have to be in charge in this moment, and it's not fair or wise to, allow everybody to post their own evacuation route on social media. Mm-hmm. So, it gets us to this question of leadership. So Mark told us what the White House was doing in March and April 2020, but, my recollection is there were lots of mixed messages coming from the White House. So in an emergency like this, who is the leader that's supposed to step forward and, put us in a place where solidarity, cooperation, unity is something that we can rally around, so that we don't have a constant battle over who's right about, which way or how the pandemic should be managed.
Boy, that is such a good point.
Yeah. And the politicians, are watching all this, and especially folks like Jim Jordan, Ron Johnson, they really start to channel this anti-censorship fervor. And the right really gets behind this cause. And it's not just that the government, in their estimation, is colluding with big tech and suppressing content, but, as Wilk mentions, like, it starts to aim towards the mainstream media, like the legacy media as well, that, the mainstream public health and government public health has all these allies in the media. And everyone's sort of towing one line that's being fed by public health. And often, in people's estimation, what they're saying is not true. It's not my lived experience, but they're all repeating it over and over again. And when I, get on the internet where, the promise is we can democratize information and I can find different sources for my information. And I start to see content that sort of speaks to me and what I'm living through during COVID suddenly gets taken down. That's really kind of fueling this whole sort of anti-censorship, anti-mainstream science, anti-government, anti-media moment. This subject of kind of the new media landscape and censorship comes up also in that conversation between Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg. And let's take a listen to that.
They were suppressing this stuff because they didn't want people to think that you could get away with not taking a vaccine, which is really crazy when you're talking about something that 99.07% of people survive. This is a crazy overstep, but scared the shit out of a lot of people. Red-pilled, as it were, a lot of people because they realized, like, oh, 1984 is like an instruction manual. It's like it shows you how things can go that way with wrong speak and with bizarre distortion of facts. And when it comes down to it, in today's day and age, the way people get information is through your platform, through X. This is how people are getting information. They're getting information from YouTube. They're getting information from a bunch of different sources now. And you can't censor that if it's real legitimate information because it's not ideologically convenient for you.
Yeah. So look, I mean, Rogan is not wrong that we're so beyond the days of like a couple of legacy news media franchises being the truth tellers. You're like 3 network news people at night, your Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. And the Biden team is trying to play whack-a-mole in a completely transformed media landscape that I'm not sure that they fully grappled with. And the more they tried to put out these little flames, the more they were fanning this forest fire. Now, look, I want to point out that there was, I think, especially for those of us who were living in the Northeast at the time, but also I get the sense that this was happening in the country too, that in those early days, I mean, I noticed like our ratings were through the roof in the news because I think people were tuning in because they did want people to sort of cut through the noise and they wanted to know the basic, just brass tacks kind of facts on the ground, right? And there were the nightly press conferences with Donald Trump, with Dr. Deborah Birx, with Dr. Anthony Fauci. So people were tuning in for that. In New York, you had the daily 11 a.m. briefing with Andrew Cuomo. But the truth is, the internet exists. And no matter what people sort of try to do to counter this incredible force of nature, which is the ability to have any information out there at a time when Wilk and Maciej have so rightly pointed out, trust is already low. Is your strategy really going to be to work with social media companies to literally post by post take shit down? That seems crazy. I don't know what the alternative is, but that seems crazy.
I think that some of the reason for that is because I think we need to take a time out here because not all of that misinformation was just like innocent confusion or, I'm just not sure. Some of it was actively trying to stir the pot, deliberately crafted to deceive people. I mean, if you look at some of the way these active anti-vaccine groups were working, I mean, they knew that like the channel to get to people. And I think there are studies that show it that they're better at engaging with individuals in undecided communities. So you can find a way to like get in there in some of these communities and sway them with misinformation. Whereas like the other side, like, the public health and pro-vaccine, they tended to operate within their own circles. And so they already had these like people that they were influenced. But some of this misinformation wasn't just like, oh, I'm not sure if this doesn't work. I mean, it was really saying harmful, dangerous things. So I think we have to remember that it wasn't always just innocent misinformation and just up for debate.
I've got a couple of questions on how this information is received. And I mean, this is really a question for Wilk, because I wonder if he and I hear this type of information that comes out of, so let's just take Joe Rogan's podcast that comes out of it. So just 2 comments on the way that vaccines are being characterized in his podcast. So he says first that, it's not a big deal because 99% of people survive, which is true. But then, of course, the right communication around this is that 1% of people don't survive. And, 1% of 330 million, it's a pretty big number. And this is one of the reasons that, this was a little bit of a crisis. And then the second thing to ask about Joe Rogan, and this is an earnest question. I don't really know how this gets played out in every community, is that at the same time that he'll make these comments about vaccines, he recognizes that he's not the authority on vaccines. So Joe Rogan has this really funny joke in one of his stand-up specials where he says, I mean, I think he says this sincerely when he's kind of talking about his own vaccine opinions. He says, if you're getting your vaccine advice from me, is that really my fault? And that's a very funny joke because it's self-deprecating, and he's kind of razzing the audience, letting them know, like, guys, you know better than to get your vaccine advice from me. Mm-hmm. So, Wilk, how are all of these messages heard? What do you take away from it when these messages come to you?
So I love that example of Joe Rogan's joke there because it makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there that are going to, internalize and actually believe that he is the authority that they need on certain things. Right. I mean, we've seen the same thing with Donald Trump. These people that do have like this Trump messianic syndrome have taken things that he has said. Some of them, I believe, in jest. Some of them just because he says things that just pop into his brain before they ever pass a logic filter. But people take information nowadays from all sorts of sources that they should never be taking information from. Joe Rogan makes an excellent point in saying that if you're getting your vaccine information from me as a source, you've probably got bigger problems. Okay, one of the big things that I've told, whether it be any one of several health professionals, and I'm no doctor, I make no bones about it. I've spent more time on bar stools in my life than I ever did in classrooms. But one of the big things I've said to all of these health professionals that I have had the honor of speaking with is I am not going to debate you on the facts of anything because you have the education, I do not. What I will do is tell you how people receive it and what maybe you should have done to relay your message better. And the most important thing that I think has been lost in this whole thing is that so many people were not listened to, so many people were not heard. And if you want to convince somebody of the truth, you better make damn sure that they feel heard in their portion of the conversation, because if they don't, their ears slam shut. So I mean, it's a very complex dynamic, but Joe Rogan is absolutely right. If you're getting your vaccine information from Joe Rogan, you've got bigger problems.
Yeah. Yeah. This, Wilk's comment about people's ears slamming shut is really important. And I want us to spend a couple minutes on it. I realize I'm not the podcast host. But
it's a party, Maciej. It's a party.
Yeah. But just before we get there, the very first handful of things that Wilk said about Rogan's comments and how they're received, I feel like it takes us to a responsibility question. So how do we come to the right answer? Do we all take personal responsibility for something like a vaccine choice? Does a podcast host with 3 million listeners, do they take the responsibility? Does the White House take the responsibility? Where do we place the responsibility here when the ecosystem of all the messaging is so mixed and varied and everywhere? It's not a rhetorical question.
It's a great question because, Brenda and I came up in a day and age where we worked at network news. As we said today, that authority, that voice has been shattered into a million different outlets. And, in the world of social media, they like to see themselves as platforms, and increasingly so, right? We are not editors. We are not content creators. We are not policing content unless it's like way over, out of bounds. They don't want to be in that business. They want to be platforms. They want to be technology companies that allow everybody to put their opinion out there, everybody put their thoughts out there. But the issue is Americans have gravitated away from getting their news from organizations that, for good or for bad, really tried to get it right. And you can write books and argue about that for forever. But there were standards, and there was a process. Now we're in a world where we're kind of out in the open water and people are putting out information and news and analysis and advice, and there are no rules. And we're not adopting new rules to police that. In fact, these platforms are saying now, we're done fact checking. We're out of that business. We're platforms. Let's let free speech reign, and let's see where we go, because that's the way we are in this modern world.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, Maciej, to your point about responsibility, I'll say this, like, in some ways, calling Joe Rogan a comic is like calling Donald Trump a reality star, right? Like, on some level, we have to recognize the impact that these people have. That while Joe Rogan may not be, an expert on vaccines, he talks about health a lot on his shows, and he's very committed to healthy living for himself. He has invested in supplements. He brings on doctors all the time. He talks about COVID. He talks about health a lot. So I do think that when he says something about vaccines and about things like ivermectin and censorship and whatever, I think people listen. I think people do view him as a trusted voice. They may not view him as an expert. And I think maybe that's something that we're now being a trusted voice doesn't necessarily mean you are an expert on any one given thing. It just means you're trusted. And I think there's kind of value in that, in learning from that, because I think there's some scary parts to that, but there's also some really interesting parts to that maybe he has an intuitive way of speaking and other people do, that sort of ask questions that a lot of people have. Now, look, I will go so far as saying that I think sometimes he goes too far with the way he answers things and really speaks out of his ass on stuff, and then it sounds like it's really true to people. And I'm just like, dude, come on. But the larger point I want to make is that we are in this place where being trusted is a little bit divorced from being an expert.
I mean, it's where the expression comes, be careful of a sheep in wolf's clothing, right? You just because you can seem trustworthy doesn't necessarily mean you are. I mean, some of these rebels or truth tellers can be just as misleading as the ones they are claiming to expose. I mean, it requires the viewer and the consumer of news and information to be more discerning. Basically, that's where we're moving. We are telling people, like, okay, if you don't really want to have these like trusted authoritarians, telling you what to do, and you be careful of like the Joe Rogans out there, it creates a space where we just all have such a bigger responsibility. And how are you going to equip yourself to handle the important decisions? We're not asking you, what do you want to eat for lunch? We're asking you to make a health decision. We're asking you, and fill in the blank. I mean, it could be anything. What are you going to do in this? I think
it's a really good point. We hear this a lot, that people say, "I'm becoming more informed." What's wrong with that? I'm making decisions about my health. I'm getting in there. I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm learning, and I'm seeing all new things. And the answer is, you can't say like, don't do that. Of course, that's good. But when you ask, like, okay, where are you getting this information that's now guiding you to make your decisions? That's not coming from your doctor, not coming from public health voices. They'll say, I'm doing the research.
Yeah.
Really? So you're getting studies and you're reading those and going through abstracts and kind of chasing that down. And I think the answer actually is no. They're listening to information entertainment, like some podcasts, that is using as content studies, but it's being filtered through the host of a podcast and served up, or it's being used as a meme in social media. And that's the information that they're getting now, that they are using to make their own decisions about their health. So I think it's again, it's hard to say no, don't become more informed. Obviously, everybody would say that's great, but I just worry about what the diet of information is and who's serving it up.
Yeah, Wilk.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the trusted source thing, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and it goes to a question that I've asked like I said, many of my health professional friends. Um, there's a saying that's, I think it's attributed to Denzel Washington or something, right? Where he says, if you don't watch the news, you're uninformed, but if you do watch the news, you're misinformed. I think it was him, but I'm not positive. But then there's also a question that I've asked, like I said, everybody from Jay Bhattacharya to Dr. Francis Collins and everybody in between, is how do two health professionals, two like highly esteemed health professionals, look at the same study and come to a different conclusion based on the evidence that they're reading, right? And that's part of science. That's part of this thing is to look at these things, evaluate the information that's in front of you, and then actually have a conversation amongst your peers about what is being said, what is being seen. One of the biggest casualties, again, during the COVID conversation was the fact that there were certain people who were being listened to and certain people that weren't. There were certain people who were being elevated and others that were being suppressed. They had information, they were looking at the same information, they were looking at the same studies, maybe coming to different conclusions, but some were allowed to speak and some were not. Some were vilified and some were, just made to be these incredible figures. And that, again, is what largely contributed to the loss of trust in some of our institutions, because if you want to elevate your message and somebody else is elevating their message better, you better either find somebody who can better convey your message, or you can't, like I said, going back to the martyr comment, right? You can't just suppress the people that you don't like or suppress the people whose information you don't agree with, because there is going to be a whole lot of people that will take that as there, to use a cliche
just to
comment, right?
pick up our history here again. Wilk, you're talking about Jay Bhattacharya, your friend. This week he is testifying in front of Congress to become Trump's new head of the NIH.
By the time this episode airs, we may know one way or the other. We may not, but yeah.
He was one of the authors of something called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was very controversial. Some people believe they were onto the right thing. Other people think this would have cost, lots of additional lives. I mean, and just in short, this was basically an argument saying, for healthy younger people, we should stop the lockdowns, loosen the restrictions, get them back out, get society moving again, while we double down on protecting elderly people or people who are health compromised. And, again, we could debate this, a lot. But the point is, he said that as soon as they put out this proclamation, he testified, a few years ago saying Google deboosted the search results. He felt that basically this declaration was like smothered and kind of lost. They actually even took it down and said a week later it was kind of popped back up. But his point is that, like, if we learn anything from this pandemic, it should be that the First Amendment is more important during a pandemic, not less. And I think that's, like, to your point, Wilk, that you have to have these alternative views, while at the same time people in public health were saying that is a view that will kill a lot of people. So that view, shouldn't be shared around to everybody, which is kind of like the crux of the matter. But Mark, do you want to pick up the story with, this big legal case that tested all of this and made it all the way to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one thing for us to talk about it, and now we're trying to figure out, okay, so who's right and where do you do that? But in the court system, and where do you go? I mean, let's talk about it. You go all the way to the Supreme Court. So basically, a group of plaintiffs decided to sue the Biden administration, alleging COVID censorship and claiming that their First Right amendments were violated, and their main grievance is that they were victims of government-driven suppression. So Anyway, Stat News sums it up by saying at the core of the lawsuit is whether the federal government's request for social media and search giants like Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to moderate COVID-19 information violated First Amendment rights. So basically, they say, well, the lawsuit centers on this term called jawboning, which is a term used to describe informal efforts by government officials to persuade someone outside the government to take action.
Never
and
heard
again,
of that word before.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's
I mean,
one of the,
it's very descriptive.
one of those who joins, we've mentioned him a
Don't
couple times now.
jawbone me. Yeah.
So Jay Bhattacharya, he joins this, and the court, Tom case,
it becomes one of the plaintiffs.
But
yeah,
it moves through. But what happens?
Yeah, so the case eventually becomes called Murthy versus Missouri, and the court hears the arguments, and they come out with their ruling, and they sort of sidestep the larger issue. In short, they said that the plaintiffs lack the standing to sue, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she wrote the majority opinion. She said that the plaintiffs failed to demonstrate a direct connection between the government's requests of social media companies to censor certain content, and then actual censorship occurring. Like, the court basically said they in the evidence presented, they're not seeing, a majority of the court said this, they're not seeing a straight through line of government requests this post be taken down, and then the post being taken down. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the social media company said, we're ultimately the ones deciding these things. It's our site. But without that clear cause and effect relationship, the court said that these individuals cannot establish that they were harmed, and that this harm is going to continue going unless the court takes action.
So basically, the Supreme Court's
yeah.
no better than us.
Well,
We're
they
just
kind
like
of
them.
they punted. Justice Alito, in his dissent, says, quote, I assume that a fair portion of what social media users had to say about COVID was of little lasting value. He says some of it was undoubtedly untrue or misleading. Some of it might have been downright dangerous. But he says, quote, for months, high-ranking government officials placed unrelenting pressure on Facebook to suppress Americans' free speech. And because the court unjustifiably refuses to address this serious threat to the First Amendment, I respectfully dissent. So he's saying, it was happening. The government was, really forcing Facebook's hand to censor people. And I just disagree with this assessment that this case has to be, that the case has to be ruled this way.
Yeah. Maciej, you have a point.
Yeah, I mean, I feel we're at this place where we're talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, how much visibility it got, and what happens when two esteemed academics disagree. I feel like I need to tell our listeners some of the dynamics that happen in academia at universities around topics like this. And some of this is just around contrarianism. So if science determines something, that, the earth is round or that vegetables are healthy, no matter how agreed upon it is, somebody will pop up to say that the opposite is true. This happens a lot in academia. And the reason this happens is there's a big reward to be won if you were right and you were the only person who saw it, and you published the key paper to show that vegetables were really unhealthy and everybody else was wrong. So there's incentives for this, and people do it. And, this is what happened in late March 2020 with this Wall Street Journal editorial that was written by Jay Bhattacharya. He thought that if he was right, that COVID was really mild and only killed 0.01% of people, like he wrote in that editorial, he thought that he would be seen as the only person who had clear enough vision to see that. And so when you assess situations like this, when it's not an emergency and when it's not a crisis, and someone's pushing a message saying that vegetables are unhealthy, you just sort of ignore it, and you understand that it likely won't get a lot of press or attention. But when it's an emergency and when there's hundreds of thousands of lives at stake, we don't have a plan. This is an extraordinarily challenging thing for us to deal with, because we don't have big microphones and we don't have public relations degrees. So this is what was happening in that time period in 2020, when academics were, we'll say, disagreeing on what the facts were around COVID.
But Maciej, to that point, and I'd love for Wilk to weigh in too, is it fair to compare it to vegetables are unhealthy and the earth is round when were the facts quite as watertight at that point about the death rate? About like, was there a meaningful platform for debate and dissent that was perhaps suppressed during that time? Like, is it fair to say with something so new, it is a literally novel coronavirus, that some of these questions that were being raised by the Jay Bhattacharyas and Marty McCarrys of the world at the time, do you feel like it was quite as just heavily imbalanced at that point in terms of the facts were just so clearly towards one side that to say anything else was actually going against the public's best interest?
Yeah, so we'll just do this one specific question. The answer on March 24th, 2020, the answer was yes. We had all the facts and all the data telling us what the death rate of COVID was. So those data first became available on February 10th. So on February 10th, we had 1,700 individuals randomly sampled that allowed us to measure how big the epidemic was in terms of all the infections, not just the symptomatic cases that were being found. And so on February 10th, the first estimates were published telling us what percentage of infected people died, and those were around 0.9%. And they varied a little bit from country to country, but it was in that 1% to 0.5% range. So 6 weeks later, by March 24th, this was incontrovertible. So 700 Americans had already died at that point out of something like 50,000 infections. We understood at that point what the rate of under ascertainment was. So that's the cases that were in the real world, but we weren't counting. And, to see this appear in the Wall Street Journal on March 24th was tough. I mean, the authors were not epidemiologists. They wrote an opinion piece, so it was not fact-checked and it was not peer-reviewed. And they didn't have the experience to kind of walk through how we do these calculations. And many of us had, done them in previous emergencies before. So this was a tough thing to have to fight. And yes, it was in the vegetables are unsafe level of bad science.
Wilk, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so I got a couple things I want to say on that. So, having all that information in March of 2020, with that being said, and this is, again, I'm not going to even pretend that I can debate the numbers or the facts of anything against a doctor when it comes to this stuff. But when I think about, layman's minds and how my mind works and what my experience was and things like that, is we clearly saw early on in the pandemic that this thing was, affecting elderly and people, the elderly and people with comorbidities and things like that. But anybody who dared say such a thing was then stifled in their ability to say things. One other thing about that is with people who were trying to speak up, since the main part of our topic is about censorship, is the self-censorship for people who didn't have protections within the universities, like maybe like a Jay Bhattacharya who had tenure at Stanford, or things like that. People whose careers were ruined for just asking questions, for dare standing up to the mainstream narrative. The Illusion of Consensus, which was a podcast that was done for a long time, partly in part by my friend Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, was just that, right? There was this illusion of consensus, but we were forced to believe that there was a consensus when quite often there was not even a conversation being allowed to happen. Now, we talk about, like I said, self-censorship, right? And you talk about Murphy versus Missouri or Missouri versus Biden or whatever stage of that you want to talk about, right? We talk about, I think about the government coming in and saying, boy, that's sure a nice social media platform. I'd hate to see something happen to it. or things like, back during the Obama administration and the cases with the NRA and different banks and things like that. This is nothing new, and it's nothing exclusive to the COVID pandemic. pandemic, this has been going on for a long time. To say people like Jay Bhattacharya and others don't have standing to sue in these cases, you have to think about the human element that comes along with this, right? Because Jay Bhattacharya was a college professor at the time who and I think everybody needs to be very careful on all sides to ascribe motives to different people unless these people have actually said this was my motive in saying this or this was my motive in doing this. But we have to realize that there were a lot of people out there who knew that there was not a consensus. They tried to speak up and had their lives and livelihoods destroyed. There were a lot of people who, based on their life experience, looking around in their communities, were hearing things on the news and from the politicians and different things and saying, I'm not seeing in my community what's happening in New York City or Chicago or LA or other major metropolitan areas, but yet my livelihood is being destroyed. And if I try to speak up, it's just going to get worse. Those kind of things, that kind of censorship is where the real ugly comes in. Because if we are not allowed to ask questions of those who have supposedly either been elected or appointed to represent us in certain situations without fear of having our lives and our livelihoods destroyed. I mean, I have known more people in the past 5 years who have had their, me being one of them, but have had some of the ugliest things said to them, had death threats for them and their families and things like that for simply stating what they believed to be the case at the time, because people ascribe motives to their behaviors that don't actually comport with anything when it comes to reality. I walked into a room with Dr. Francis Collins, who I consider a very, very dear friend, even though I completely disagree with many of the things he stood for during the pandemic. I love the man. And I walked into a room with him, and somebody said as we were walking by, never in my life have I been in the presence of such evil.
Oof.
That is ridiculous.
No, you are 100% right, Wilk. But look, on this topic of censorship, Tom, let's keep going on this narrative. Let's keep going on the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to wrap up this portion of it, Trump wins the election. It's interesting. I just went back and checked Biden's farewell address. He actually calls out social media companies for dropping their fact checking, and he says the truth is smothered by lies for profit and power. Zuckerberg says, he's sorry he listened to the Biden administration's pressure to police the information on COVID, and he's done with all that. Jay Bhattacharya's Supreme Court case on government censorship didn't go as he envisioned, but now he's well on his way to becoming the next head of NIH. And in December, he tells an audience to kill free speech is to kill science. So we are moving, this story now into Trump 2.0. Trump wins. He's surely fueled in some part by Americans who feel that they were censored. Trump's sworn in. The administration's handed the reins of the government and public health. So what do these anti-censorship crusaders do right out of the gate? It kind of looks like when it comes to public health, they in fact start censoring.
Oh man. Yeah. That is really interesting. When we come back, we're going to talk about this new phase we're in. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So Maggie, take us through what goes down in the first week of the Trump administration, an administration that came into town kind of riding on this kind of anger over what many perceived as the Biden administration's censorship of dissenting opinions during the pandemic.
Yeah, so Brenda, right out the gate, Trump signs a slew of executive orders. He pulls the United States out of the World Health Organization, and literally just moments after being sworn in, also bans anyone in the federal government from doing anything that unconstitutionally abridges the free speech of any American citizen. Mark, I think you had some interesting points on what these actually entailed.
Yeah, I mean, some of this did a lot of reporting on this in those early days. I mean, the pace of the executive orders was impressive. I mean, there were lots. And one of the ones that he signed on the first day in office is called, quote, restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. So here's what the order states, quote, over the last 4 years, the previous administration trampled free speech rights by censoring American speech on online platforms, often by exerting substantial coercive pressure on third parties, such as social media companies, to moderate, deplatform, or otherwise suppress speech that the federal government did not approve, under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. The federal government infringed on the constitutionally protected speech rights of American citizens across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. Government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society. And then the order goes on to say, we're going to put some teeth into this, and the attorney general is going to investigate. So we're not only going to just not do this anymore, we have to go back in time and get a report back to Trump. So Maggie, then what does he do?
Then he signs an order entitled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. And now what this does is basically shut down all of the government's diversity, equity, and inclusion actions and programs. And this has a really wide breadth of effects. He signs the Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. And this order states, quote, agencies shall remove all statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications, or other internal and external messages that promote or otherwise inculcate gender ideology, and shall cease issuing such statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications, or other messages, which again is a lot. And I think, Mark, you were going to break this down a little more for us on what it meant.
Yeah, I mean, so now there are these executive orders and people are afraid. You have to remember it. Now, this is a time when they're talking about efficiency. We're talking about getting emails to, explain your worth, where there are, risks of losing your job if you don't comply. And, I'm speaking with people who are employees in the government facing this kind of charge. And one of them tells me, quote, they felt gagged and prohibited from doing their work. I mean, these are people that work at HHS. I mean, government employees are, scared about what they have to do to stay employed. They're concerned about what they can say, what they can't say, what they can and can't research. I mean, they were even given lists of words that basically these are now, I had somebody tell me that they were called the naughty words. Like they cannot use these words: gender, transgender, pregnant person, inclusivity, transsexual, non-binary, LGBT. So I mean, and then, we all have these, the idea of pronouns and how that was, too woke for anybody. And so now they're also told you must, and they have a very quick deadline, eliminate your pronoun signatures. And I asked an employee, so what if you don't do that? What's going to happen? They said they would be fired. They literally said they would lose their job. So, the government researchers were then, it's even a step further. So it's a barrage of these kinds of things. So the government researchers were then ordered to recall papers they had submitted to medical journals. So if you had submitted a journal, if it was in peer review, you had to contact the journal. So now this is almost like a proxy for social media companies. Before it was, the Biden administration telling social media companies what to put. Now you have actual researchers conducting science. Now they need to call, the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Lancet, British Medical Journal, all of these top impact factor journals and tell them, what, that paper I submitted to you, I need that back because the government is not telling me that that is okay. The government is saying that whatever I submitted is not in line with the executive orders. And so these things are actually happening. They go out to the journals. And I actually reached out to all of these journals to find out, well, what are you doing about this? And, a lot of them surprisingly said no comment. Some of them said, what, we are going to stand on the side of science and we don't do retractions unless there are serious concerns about the scientific validity or integrity. And, we remain committed to advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and health. And none of this executive order is going to stop us. And no, we're not going to just take your paper out just because you said so. Like you have to have a reason. And we can't just do that. The other thing that happened is these CDC researchers are now saying, okay, well, if you want to salvage some of this research, what are you going to do? Let's now recode things and change the phrasing. And that really does speak to the fact that these researchers wanted to get this work out and they're willing to do some changes, but it does open up a huge issue of ethics. Now you're going to start changing the way you're gathering data and doing this research. So public health, Maggie, is facing a kind of again, it's not to the level of extent of COVID, but it's this idea that you have to make these decisions in real time. They're hard decisions and you have to do it fast. So what is public health going to do?
Yeah, so public health really sees this as a moment that's an assault on science itself. By deleting specific words from our public discourse, these policies aren't changing biological reality. They're simply making it harder to study and address and mitigate health risks. And the executive orders that restrict scientific language, it's not just about semantics at the end of the day. They're these direct assaults on our data integrity, evidence-based medicine, and our public health preparedness as a whole. And at a time when misinformation already threatens the trust in science, suppressing key terminology only serves to widen this gap between research and the communities that we hope to serve. The editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Public Health was quoted as saying, "It sounds incredible that this is compatible with the First Amendment. How can the government decide what words a journal can use to describe a scientific reality? That reality needs to be named." And after a backlash in the media, some of the sites, publications, and studies are restored, which was good. But for public health, this is an all-out assault on science. And the head of major public health advocacy groups have said things like the muzzling of public health agencies we're seeing now is not just political interference, it is censorship of vital scientific information that can affect the health of the public. And these actions also signal to scientists to self-censor, like myself and other colleagues, to not engage out of fear of retribution, which ripples out to every American as when experts feel like they can't speak up or that they have to stay silent, less ultimately is shared.
Yeah. And look, I want to say that, we focused on this section about DEI and LGBTQ and gender stuff, but I'd say, and we know this country has a sort of fraught relationship with those terms. But even on some other levels where you had a meeting to determine which flu strain a vaccine should be made was just abruptly canceled and not rescheduled. You've had, there was a freeze on communications that I believe has been lifted. And some of the stuff, by the way, I know is a moving target. There's some stuff that's been lifted here and there. But I want to ask, not all of it, absolutely. Wilk, let me ask you something. So look, we just got finished talking about this, COVID and this feeling that people were muzzled and silenced and censored. Do you see why folks in public health are now feeling the same thing? And what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked. And I guess there's two key things I want to hit on here because I think they're separate but related. Number one, I go back to a phrase my dad used to use all the time. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. The executive order is very similar. You live by the executive order, you die by the executive order. Our government has become far too powerful, and stuff like this is proof of the ridiculousness of some of the power that they have, and the power of the executive branch, and the overall. We've come to this position as a country where we allow way too many things to happen via the executive order, and again, another thing that's not exclusive to any one party or one person. It's a problem. The other thing I will say is when it comes to like DEI and the power of the words that we're able to use to describe certain things and everything else. I, as an employee within any major corporation, am held to a standard, things that I can say, things that I can do, places where I can speak my mind in certain ways, all at the expense of my job. If I say something that does not comport with the standards or ethics or mission of that company, right? The federal government is really no different in that sense. So I have a huge problem with people who govern by executive order. I have a huge problem with this whole thing that Maggie was describing, and in that certain terminology is not allowed to be used, and Mark talking about the different papers that are trying to be pulled from journals because people's fear that what they wrote, which under these standards is not going to now fly under the new standards. I think that's all garbage. I think that's all garbage, but it's a testament to a couple things, right? The the poison that executive orders are, and the idea that government should somehow, government employees should somehow be protected, where people within the private sector are not, because we're held to, they're held to a different standard. So I hope I made my point there. I don't know if I exactly did the way that I wanted, but I think it's important to remember that people in every major corporation are always, especially in the age of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been one of these things, and in corporate America, that has cost people careers because they say the wrong thing to the wrong person, or they use the wrong pronouns, or they dare say, yeah, I really don't know how much equity and equality really equate to each other, because they really don't. Um, these are the same things that people in corporate America have been dealing with for a long time. Now we're seeing it in the federal government.
Yeah.
I don't like how it's being imposed. I think it's messy. I think it's ugly. I think it's
right. Maciej, let me ask you the same question. We just went through this walkthrough of these feelings of censorship during the pandemic. Do you think it's a similar vibe now? Do you feel like there's or do you feel like there's a better case to be made for what's happening now to truly call that some form of censorship?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with my own experience over the past 6 weeks or so. I mean, is there attempted censorship by the White House now? Yes, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't even call it attempted censorship. So the program that I work with, the President's Malaria Initiative, which sits inside USAID, I mean, just 90% of the staff were fired. So I think they're saying it and then they're executing it. So now any sort of malaria program that was running in Africa just has disappeared, programs that were under PMI.
And that's censorship. And you view that as a form of censorship.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so, I view this as destroying trust is one thing. It's also just destroying programs that are helping people. Is it a form of censorship? I mean, it certainly feels like it. I mean, again, I don't know what qualifies as, legitimate use of executive power or not in this particular case. I mean, to Mark's point about publications being censored, I'm also an editor at 2 journals, and we've faced the same thing. So there are papers that have come across my desk where I've been asked to either remove authors or reconsider whether they'll go through the process. So this to me is a clear form of censorship. It's obvious somebody's telling me, please don't publish this, or please remove people's names. And because this is kind of clear and obvious, I've simply said no, because it's a free speech issue. And at an academic journal, what we do is we send papers out for peer review. And if the reviews come back negative, we don't publish it. If the reviews come back positive, we do publish it. So in this particular case, it's been clear what the right course of action is. But for the removal of entire programs, I mean, I think the rebuilding of trust in the programs themselves is a multi-year, multi-decade process if this actually goes through.
And so I just want to end on some final thoughts from both of you, which is, Maciej, is there, did you learn anything from this conversation? Is there anything that you walk away with, maybe that you didn't come in with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of the points that Wilk raises were things that were talked about in 2020, but they were talked about, under the priority, which at the time was, reducing the spread of the pandemic. So they didn't have as much attention, and they didn't have as much of a loud voice as they should have had during that time. By 21 and certainly 22, when we got out of it, I think, we failed. to put some things right. So just, a very obvious gap is our inability to look at the educational system and say, well, how are we going to catch these kids up now? How are we going to put billions of dollars back into the educational system? But the thing the thing that always comes back to for me is leadership. And we didn't have it during this crisis. And I mean, this was our biggest crisis as a country since 1941. We didn't have, whether it's, the president or the vice president, the CDC, the NIH, we didn't have a person stand up and explain how we were all going to get through this together. And this was the thing that just sowed division, allowed us to disintegrate into 1,000 separate groups. And of course, when that happens for 18 months, you come out of it in 2022 and people just don't like each other. They mistrust each other. I think that missed opportunity for leadership in 2020 is the thing that we'll be looking back on 10, 20 years from now and wishing we'd had.
Boy, I really couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Wilk, what are your kind of parting thoughts here? Is there anything you leave this conversation with maybe that you didn't come in with?
Well, first, what Maciej just said is incredible. I mean, it's very important. It's a very important point that everybody needs to internalize. Is we had an opportunity in this crisis to come together as a nation, and we missed our mark. And I think a lot of that does come down to leadership, mismessaging, and just the lack of real communication. And the messaging from the top was a huge part of that. What I come away from this conversation is the same thing I come away from in so many conversations that I get to have with, people that I disagree with, right? I get different perspectives, and I get the ability to see that, again, something I mentioned earlier, when we ascribe motives to people's actions that we've never actually had conversations with, we lose our own ability to really learn. So I've heard some incredible things here from our panel, if you want to call it that. But it's been a great conversation, and it's conversations like these that allow people to open their minds, and it's only with an open mind and a strong conversation that we're ever going to get through this. And if we have more conversations like this, bigger conversations like this, the next time something like this happens, because it will happen, unfortunately, it will happen. Maybe not in any one of our lifetimes, but it's going to happen again. If it happens tomorrow, we're going to go into it in worse shape than we went into the last one.
Yeah.
But if we allow our minds to be opened and allow the conversation to be had in an open and honest way, maybe we can find the leader that gets us through the next one in a much better fashion than we got through the last one.
Amen to that. That is a good note to end on. I want to thank Dr. Maciej Boni and Wilk Wilkinson for joining us on this podcast. And thank you to our listeners. Like we said, this is our 10th episode, and we're only here because of all of you. And your feedback is really wonderful for us to look through. So please email us questions at whyshoulditrustyou.net. I'm Brenda. He's Dr. Mark. She's Maggie. He's Tom. And thank you so much. We'll see you right back here next week.